All right, what's up, everybody? Thursday, October 24th. We got some more hysterical headlines from Zero Hedge today. Yesterday, I did a video about that blog. Stay away. I say you should stay away. Anyway, today's hysterical headlines were about the Fed's repo operations. I think the Fed injected, right, something like 135 billion or 138 billion. So Zero Hedge, of course, which all of their articles are slanted with a negative perspective. It's always the end of the world. It's always doom and gloom. It's always we're ready to have hyperinflation or whatever, or massive deflation. Everything is terrible. So let me talk about this because, you know, we get back into this discussion of the reason behind these operations. Back in early September, or just around that time, actually probably late August, reserve balances went way down. Remember, the Fed was still doing that roll-off of its balance sheet. They were still shrinking their balance sheet, and they brought reserve balances down too low. They actually came down to probably below the threshold of that 10% reserve ratio to deposits, right? There was 13 trillion of deposits in the system, and reserves briefly fell below that. Interesting, as an interesting side comment here, last week, Jamie Dimon in an interview said, hey, we had the reserves and we would have loved to lend them out, but we were under regulatory constraint and we couldn't do that because we had to, show that we had enough liquidity. So all this goes to just bad regulatory environment right now. The whole thing can be fixed with the stroke of a pen if Congress does that, and if the Fed decide, and I think Congress may have done that, but they gave discretion up to the Fed to implement this policy, and I don't think the Fed has done anything. I could be wrong on that, but it is a regulatory issue. Anyway, reserves went down too low. The overnight rate spiked above the Fed funds rate. Remember, the Fed funds rate is the Fed's policy tool. It uses that to regulate the economy. Now, we can get into a whole separate discussion on whether or not that's effective. I'm not going to do that right now, but that's its primary tool on regulating the economy. It doesn't like when the overnight lending rate rises above its policy rate. So it had to go back in there and add reserves, and that's what it has been doing. Now, the interesting thing is that in the last 2-week period, the Fed added something like 198 billion in reserves through those repos, but the overall amount of reserves in the system only went up by 11 billion. So you see there was a tremendous drain still going on because Treasury was selling debt securities and tax payments were coming in, so that was draining out. So all the Fed was doing was keeping that level stable in order to sustain its Fed funds rate. All right, and that's what it said it was going to do. When it came out with that announcement a couple of Fridays ago and said, we're boosting everything, we're going to start buying T-bills all the way through the second quarter of next year. We're going to raise the amount of the repos that we do every day and the 14-day term repos. It said our goal is to keep reserve balances at the level where they were in early September, and they were at about 1.48 trillion. And guess what? Last week, because they release their report every week on Thursday, we'll get the new report today, but last week, guess where reserves were? 1.48 trillion. And I suspect when we see the number tonight, it's going to be around the same thing, maybe 1.5 trillion, that's fine. So they're doing what they need to do to maintain their policy rate. And that's what they said they're going to do. Now, don't expect Zero Hedge to understand this, okay? They're going to put up, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm being cynical here, I don't believe this, but maybe some people believe that they do actually know, but they put up these crazy headlines and blog posts, you know, to get people to read them. Like I said yesterday, the doom and gloom stuff, the scary stuff, that gets people's attention. All right, the sensational stuff, the hyperbolic stuff, that gets people's attention. But I personally, I don't think they understand it. I think, you know, it's typical. It's you know, one of these blogs where everything is doom and gloom, and it's, you know, hard money, and we should go back to the gold standard, and, you know, that kind of stuff. So you have that going on, and I've been arguing that the Fed's operations, as long as that's their intention, just to sustain their policy rate and to, you know, that it'll find some reserve level where that is effective, and it's probably around 1.5 trillion, 1.48 trillion. Well, again, we'll see tonight's numbers, and I put this out every week to my subscribers. That's stability. Okay? That just adds stability to the whole picture. And like I said yesterday, you know, that's a positive for the market. So I don't see this as anything to get hysterical over. I don't see this as anything bad. By the way, if you look at sentiment indicators, they're still very much slanted to pessimism and bearish sentiment. I mean, I just looked today at the put-call ratio, and if you look at the 10-day average of the put-call ratio or the 20-day average of the put-call ratio, still elevated above the historical average. It's not in any way indicating a top. Now, as we get towards the end of this month and towards November 1st, things could get a little bit different. November 1st, of course, the government will make its usual first of the month payments. You're talking about tens of billions that are going to be spent out. Right now, the government's balance in its account at the Fed is about almost 390 billion. Now remember, we went up. In August, it was 111 billion. So it's up almost like 300 billion. So that's a huge drain, right? If the government's account is going up, it came from the banking system, and so that's a drain of 300. Of course the Fed has to add. You've had a drain in that period of time, what? August, September, October, 2 months of 300 billion coming out of the system. If the Fed didn't do anything, we would be way, way, way below that 10% reserve ratio. And banks would be, they'd be in big trouble. The other thing here, and again, going back to what Jamie Dimon said, and he really shined the light on a particular part of the problem, which is reserves are not equally spread out. The big banks are where most reserves are concentrated. The little guys, you know, they got to look around when they make loans. They got to borrow those reserves. Jamie Dimon said, and I don't know how much of this was true and how much of this, you know, he might have lent them out at the higher rate. He might have been part of the problem. But he said, hey, look, I would have loved to lend out our reserves, but we couldn't because we were under regulatory constraints. So that's part of the problem too, is that reserves are not distributed equally. The big banks have most of them. All this stuff could be solved with the stroke of a pen, all right? But anyway, you have to understand this. If you want to trade the markets like intelligently and not be just like throwing darts at a dartboard or, you know, rolling the dice, you have to understand it. But you don't have to if you don't want to. I mean, you could roll the dice. You could guess like most people do. Or you can go to Las Vegas. You'll have a better time. Beautiful weather, beautiful hotels, nice food and entertainment. Or you can do what you're doing and just roll the dice and not understand these things. But when you have the understanding, when you have the knowledge, That's like you're an insider, man. You know, you could take advantage of people who do not understand. As long as you have the mental game. Remember, that's the most important thing. I know you don't like me talking about that. But after I made that video about the mental game, a lot of people said, Mike, come on, we need you to keep talking about mental game. It's so important. And I will. I'm going to intersperse that. Anyway, that's it for this video. See you later. Bye-bye.